Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video we tell you how did Soviet react to moon landing. You've probably heard of conspiracy theories that the moon landing was a hoax. Those are false and easily debunked. But have you heard the one about how the moon race was itself a hoax, because the Soviet Union was never trying to get to the moon in the first place, or at least that's what the Soviets claimed to cover up their unsuccessful lunar landing program. It was a lie that held fast until 1989, when a group of American aerospace engineers went to Moscow and finally saw the Soviets' failed lunar landing craft for themselves. President John F. Kennedy kicked off the moon race in 1961 by announcing the U.S. would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. From then on, NASA's program to reach the moon before the Soviet Union was public information. In contrast, the Soviet Union didn't publicize its own program, or even officially admit it had one. After the U.S. reached the moon on July 20, 1969, the Soviet Union continued its lunar landing program into the early 70s while still publicly denying its existence. At first, secrecy was necessary so that no one would overtake us, wrote journalist Yaroslav Golovanov in the Soviet newspaper, Komsomolskaya Pravda. But later, when they did overtake us, we had to maintain secrecy so that no one knew that we had been overtaken. Soviet spokesman also said the country was more interested in creating satellites and sending robotic probes to the moon than manned missions that risked human life. In broadcasts to Latin America, Africa and Asia, Radio Moscow framed Apollo 11 as the fanatical squandering of wealth looted from the oppressed peoples of the developing world. For many Americans who worked in and reported on aerospace research, this denial was never believable. One of these Americans was James Oberg, a NASA space engineer from 1975 to 1997 who speaks Russian and has written multiple books about the U.S. and Soviet space programs. In 1979, he wrote an article for Reason magazine arguing many of the same elements that characterized preparations for the Apollo moon landings also showed up in the Soviet program. He also noted that Soviet cosmonauts during the 1960s spoke as though they were in a race with the U.S. to the moon. I can positively state that the Soviet Union will not be beaten by the United States in the race for a human being to go to the moon, said cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov in 1966. A year before his tragic death during re-entry, the U.S. has a timetable of 1969 plus X, but our timetable is 1969 plus X minus 1, i.e. the Soviets would make it the moon a year before the Americans. Yet some conspiracy-minded Americans were swayed by the Soviet Union's propaganda, and began to suspect the U.S. government had invented the competition in order to rationalize the enormous financial investment in NASA's moon mission. Unlike modern moon landing deniers, many prominent moon race deniers held influential positions in politics and media. Senator J. William Fulbright said in 1963 that, "The probable truth is that we are in a race not with the Russians, but with ourselves." And in a 1964 editorial titled, "Debating the Moon Race," the New York Times wrote, "There is still time to call off what has become a one-nation race." On the moon landing's 5th anniversary in July 1974, CBS anchor Walter Cronkite told America, "It turned out that the Russians were never in the race at all. In truth, the Soviets were in a moon race with the U.S. during the 1960s. And they were fairly confident they could beat the Americans because they'd had all the firsts." Oberg says, "They had the first satellite. the first probe to land on the moon and the first man and woman in space. In fact, the Soviets thought the U.S. timetable for reaching the moon was just propaganda because it seemed too ambitious. When Apollo 11 really did land there in 1969, just 8 years after JFK's announcement of the country's intentions. Oberg says the Soviets slowly came to realize they'd woken the sleeping giant, that they had driven the US government insane enough to spend absolutely crazy amounts of money to do this. Still, the Soviets continued their lunar landing program into the early 70s because they didn't know if the US would continue its lunar exploration. If the Americans had a setback and quit or just got tired and stopped, then the Soviets could move in and outdo American lunar flight, he says. But by 1972, they realized that they just couldn't build the rockets or the spacecraft reliable enough to do that. Though they did build a lunar lander intended for cosmonauts to use on the moon, they couldn't reliably send it there. The fact that the Soviets had built a lunar landing craft intended for the moon remained a secret until 1989. When American aerospace engineers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology received a tour of the student engineering laboratory at the Moscow Aviation Institute. Even then, the revelation was kind of an accident, says Lawrence Young, who was one of the engineers on the trip and is now the Apollo program professor emeritus of aeronautics and astronautics at MIT. I hope you enjoy our video. If you enjoy our video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share.